I also want to have a discussion in general about the life cycle of top tier meta archetypes, because I feel like that's also where one of my main frustration lies with this format or with Snake Eye in general. Josh, there are only two outcomes. Bans did nothing or deck is dead. I don't make the rules. Yeah, here's the thing. I share the pain with you guys. I wanted Snake Eye to die, but the more I think about it, the less I feel like that was realistic for multiple reasons. One of them is obviously lore, which is the stupidest one. I feel like this situation at the moment with Snake Eyes really warrants a discussion about the way I would call it is like the life cycle of competitive top tier Yu-Gi-Oh decks and what we want it to be and what we know it like how this situation works. So what I mean by this is I've been thinking a lot recently about like how long top tier Yu-Gi-Oh decks should stay around or how long they have stayed around historically, and in general, how do you handle top tier Yu-Gi-Oh deck in any given format? Because like, let's be real, good Yu-Gi-Oh decks or best decks in Yu-Gi-Oh happens a lot. Most formats has like either one best deck or maybe a couple, but for the most part, those are like situations that happen every time in Yu-Gi-Oh! Whether it's Snake Eye this year, or Cash Tira last year, or Tearlament and Sprite the year before that, or even back in the day, decks like, I don't know, Necros, Dragon Rulers, all those kind of decks. There's always been this sort of like behavior of deck becomes powerful, deck is being played a lot, and deck eventually gets hit on the list. And like, I just want to talk about how long should that life cycle be and exactly how do you handle a deck? Because do you go from leaving the deck untouched and then immediately killing it, or do you go from like just trying to make it a little bit weaker so it probably still is a good deck, and then eventually 2 lists later or 3 lists later, that's when you kill it? Or you wait and see if maybe new Yu-Gi-Oh decks just are more powerful and you can naturally solve it by just releasing a more powerful deck. At least I feel like historically it's been very often the case that it goes something like this. We have a deck that releases, maybe it becomes powerful because it gets support, doesn't matter, but it starts to become a powerful force in the metagame. And maybe it's even the best deck undisputed, or maybe it's part of the best couple decks in the format. And let's say there's a first ban list. Do we really expect them to kill the deck 3 months in? Usually not, right? Like the last list, for example, was that one for Snake Eye. Like, did anyone really expect Snake Eyes to die on the April ban list this year? No. Usually, I feel like the community quote-unquote expectation for a list like that is like that first list, we expect it to remain powerful, but maybe get like a slight hit to it. Right? It's probably going to be still a dominant force in the next format. And then we expect another ban list at some point. So now here's my question. Do we expect that next ban list after the first one was just a slight tap on the wrist? Is the next one the one that needs to completely kill it? Or does it need to like significantly hit the deck, make it weaker? You know, like, I don't know if killing it is the right way to phrase it. Let's say this lifespan is like 6 months or something, which actually is the current lifespan of Snake Eye. And I feel like historically, at least, after let's say 6.5 months, most decks have not been killed. So I feel like the reasonable thing to expect after 6.5 months is to have a significant hit to the deck. Maybe it's still playable, but it's significantly weaker. Maybe other decks are now the top dogs of the format, but you could hypothetically still cope on that deck, and then it's eventually going to phase out. Or if there's another ban list and the deck still was too powerful, then now is when we kill it, right? So a rough lifespan of between, let's say, 7 to 10 months for a top tier deck before it like starts to be tier 3 or like definitely significantly worse feels like historically is what we should be able to expect. I think with Snake Eye specifically, here's my thing. 6 months of Snake Eye format just feels like longer. That's the problem, because people don't like Snake Eye. I think what we have to talk about as well in this whole discussion is just like designing as well, right? Like, how is this archetype designed? Because I feel like we as a community are more willing to accept a deck for a longer period of time, even if it is a very powerful deck, if it's just more fun. It's not only about this deck has been meta for too long, because it's not been meta for longer than some other decks have. It's just like that the meta isn't great with it in it, right? Here is my biggest frustration and the thing that makes the least amount of sense to me in this whole year of 2024, and it has nothing to do with this ban list, because in my opinion, if this ban list was the way it is and Rage of the Abyss just didn't exist, it would probably be all right. It doesn't make Snake Eye unplayable. I understand that people want that. That's fair. But it does hit Snake Eye relatively hard, and you could expect that other decks might be better than Snake Eye now. And if we have a new set with new archetypes in it, right? If Rage of the Abyss, instead of bringing Snake Eye support, was bringing other archetypes that could maybe rival the now little bit nerfed version of Snake Eye, maybe it'd be fine. Maybe we would be looking forward to Rage of the Abyss instead of like dreading it. And this is where my frustration lies at the moment. We've just talked about this whole life cycle of a top tier deck in the history of Yu-Gi-Oh as well. Like most historic decks have like a couple of formats where they're powerful and then they phase out, right? It's usually not just one format. There are multiple formats where Dragon Ruler was the best deck. There are multiple formats where Necros was the best deck. There are multiple formats where a lot of other decks were powerful and probably even the best deck in the game. That is not unusual. But what is really unusual and completely blows my mind is the fact that we are printing Snake Eye support at the end of 2024. And this is something that I feel like is unprecedented to this level in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, maybe ever? Let me know if you can think of examples. Branded is a different example because Branded was never this dominant. I'm not asking for an example of, hey, this is a deck that got support for a long time. That's not what I mean. That is not my point. My point is that this is the best deck we're talking about. You'll understand how weird this sounds if you've been around at those times. This is basically like if they printed custom Necros support at the end of 2015. Can you imagine how dumb that would have sounded? Towards the end of 2019 TOS format, instead of printing new decks, they just print like a set that has just like a broken Thunder Dragon card in it and a broken Sky Striker card and a broken Salamangreat card in it. It so intuitively makes sense that they've never done that. It's common sense to be like, hey, yeah, if these decks have been dominant for the full year, basically, you're not printing another wave of really good support for it. It blows my mind. It's like releasing new Dragon Rulers at the end of 2014. Like, oh, sorry, we banned the babies. Here are replacements to make sure the deck is still good in 2014. This is what they're doing right now. And this is what I wanted to bring up. And my main frustration with this entire situation is not this ban list, because this ban list did a lot of reasonable things. This is why I think we need to talk about set design. What we're experiencing right now is the huge downside of them basically making all these lore decks that last for a much longer time, which is a more recent thing, I feel like. Is the Albaz lore the first kind of example like this? Oh, World Chalice, maybe. Yeah, you could argue World Chalice also kind of worked like that. I think even technically Clifford, Shaddoll were like part of the same lore, right? And Satellar, but I feel like it was different back then because they were distinctively different decks. It wasn't like all support being pumped into one deck. Clifford and Shaddoll never went together. Satellar and Shaddoll never went together. Dual Terminal also was a lore kind of thing, but most of the dual terminal archetypes are still contained within themselves, right? They didn't do all that much cross references and, oh, this card is in this artwork and this archetype is connected to that archetype and so on and so forth. There are some examples of it, but for the most part, especially when it comes to meta archetypes, it was just like their own thing. It's weird. And I think right now we are experiencing the huge downside that this can have. Good set design does not always go hand in hand with good game design. Conceptually, this is something that people are a fan of. When lores like that go on for a long time and when there's a story behind the cards, that is something that people like. And I think that's why they're doing it. But here's the problem. As cool as it is when you're releasing cards that belong together for an entire year or something, you have to be really careful with balancing. Because if those cards are too powerful, then suddenly you severely limit the ability of your game balancing team to really hit those cards in a significant way. Because from a game balancing aspect, those archetypes that are at the top of the meta need to be toned down significantly at some point. And you cannot just keep releasing more and more and more and more support into those archetypes, because then you will never get rid of them. This is something that you have to be careful with. This was already kind of mediocre with the Visas archetype. Yes, they were different decks, but the game was still very heavily dominated by different Visas archetypes. It was Tearlament first, then it was Kashtira second, but at least those were different decks. With the Snake Eye lore, my huge problem with it is the fact that somehow all of this stuff, all of these different archetypes, they all go into the same deck. Why is it all Snake Eye support? You cannot make up a possible excuse. Oh, but it's the lore that Snake Eyes just have something to do with all of them. Brother, they made the lore. Just make a different lore. The Azaminas, instead of being, I don't know, best friends with the Snake Eyes, make a lore where the Azaminar are good friends with the White Forest cards. and then you can make the Azamina support White Forest. Because technically, White Forest is part of that lore. Does White Forest receive good support in Rage of the Abyss? No. Does Azamina work well with White Forest? I mean, a little bit, but not nearly as much as it works with Snake Eye. Goblin Biker is part of that lore. Is there a new support archetype in Rage of the Abyss that supports Goblin Biker? No. They could have made lore for that. It doesn't make any freaking sense. And this is why I'm a little bit less skeptical of this ban list, because if you really think about it, what were they supposed to do? The Konami card designers in the OCG thought it was a great idea to like make the Azamina archetype crazy, insane, get you an Omni Negate in Snake Eyes. And now the TCG ban list designers have to deal with that. The main archetype of Rage of the Abyss, basically, which is a water set, you know, new mermails and stuff like that. The deck that benefits the most from that set is the Fire Snake Eye deck. And because of that mind-blowing decision by the OCG set designers, the TCG is in this position right now where I'm pretty sure they simply weren't allowed, or it doesn't make sense for them to kill Snake Eye right now. They just couldn't do it, right? Because like that set is so bad. My main frustration is with that set. I just don't understand why that set was designed that way. It just puts us in such a bad position. And the OCG is in the same boat, like the OCG player base. They also didn't get rid of Snake Eye for them. Snake Eye is still dominating the OCG. It's not even that close. It's only Tenpai and Snake Eye. TCG could have banned Flamberge and Azamina was still very powerful. It's just not the designer's fault. It is. I think they just want to make sure that Azamina sells. I don't want to get all of the blame off of the TCG balancing team. They could have done more to Snake Eye and Azamina would have still sold. Personally, I don't believe that the only people making those decisions are the ones that are here for game balancing, right? I think there's a lot of other people involved in the decision making of a ban list. I'm pretty sure even the OCG, as like the mother corporation, is involved with the TCG ban list to an extent. I think there is a real possibility that there were people at Konami who were like, we want to hit Snake Eye harder, but then there were other people at Konami who said, you can't do that. I don't know if that's true. I'd like to think it is. So in that regard, I am willing to cut them some slack and say the major issue is the fact that they are forced to try and sell Azamina as good as possible, which is an archetype that quite frankly shouldn't have existed or should have supported something else. You could have maybe made it so that there's a deck that is more centered around Diabellstar itself, right? Even Snake Eye isn't centered about Diabellstar. You're summoning Diabellstar, and your main goal with Diabellstar is to get it off of the field as soon as possible to summon Snake Eye Ash. It's not about Diabellstar. Diabellstar is just a fancy version of 1-for-1. Mind-blowing core set design this year. Really. This was the first OCG metagame report after Rage of the Abyss, which released the Azamina archetype, right? With Snake Eye, here's what they wrote. An opening with 1 Sinful Spoils Deception plus any monster card is as follows. Now, pay attention to this. Activate Sinful Spoils Deception. Sinful Spoils Deception effect. Tribute 1 monster from hand. Add Sacred Azamina from deck to hand. Activate Sacred Azamina. Send Sinful Spoils Deception from field to the graveyard to fusion summon Azamina Murcielago. Azamina Murcielago effect. Add Wanted Seeker of Sinful Spoils from your deck to your hand. Activate Wanted to add Diabellstar. Wanted effect banish to place and draw 1. Special summon Diabellstar. Set original Sinful Spoils. Murcielago plus Diabellstar make Moon of the Closed Heaven. Sacred Azamina effect. Shuffle Murcielago into the deck. Add Sacred Azamina from graveyard to hand. Activate Sacred Azamina. Send original Sinful Spoils Snake Eye from field to graveyard. Fusion summon Rhea Silvera. Original Snake Eye effect banish itself from the graveyard as cost. Add Snake Eye Ash from deck to hand. Place Diabellstar from graveyard to the bottom of the deck. This simple opening sets up Moon of the Closed Heaven on the field, which can then go into the Fiendsmith combo. Snake Eye Ash in hand, which can be normal summoned. It also brings out Azamina Rhea Silvera early, which can negate an opponent's card or effect, protecting the rest of your combo from disruption. This Azamina continuous spell over here does everything and more, and you draw 1 with Wanted. This does not only replace consistency, this is the best starter they've ever had, period. In the TCG, it's even more frustrating, I feel like, because that weakness to Nibiru that the deck kind of has now, it's out of the window when they can summon an Omni before summon 5. If Snake Eye is going to be less popular now in the TCG, it's going to return after Rage of the Abyss. There is a few things worth noting about this. There is other counterplay to the Azamina cards a little bit. Cards like Ghost Ogre become better against the deck. Cards like Droll, Retaliating Sea is seeing a resurgence in the OCG right now. But here's the thing. No one would ever in their right mind ask for that when we're talking about a top tier meta deck like 7 months into its lifespan. Hey, give this deck more support so that we play the hand trap minigame, but with other hand traps now. oh, instead of drawing Imperm Veiler, I now want to draw Retaliating Sea and Droll. Like, that's not what we're asking for. That doesn't make sense. Like, yeah, there's counterplay to it, but that's not the point. Before Rage of the Abyss, this ban list is okay. I think especially pure Snake Eye will suffer from it. It's easier to interrupt now. It's not dead. So if you wanted it to be dead, then I guess this ban list did not do enough for you. It also did not do enough for me. I wish they killed it. I understand why they didn't kill it though, because of Rage of the Abyss, right? And that's the frustrating part. Feel free to let me know in the comments what you think of this whole situation. I personally just feel like they need to be more careful with these lore archetypes. You can clearly see with Snake Eye what happens if you don't carefully design those lore archetypes, because they put us in a very weird position.